You're listening to the NVus Alien Podcast with your host, Heather Woodward, an award-winning psychic, supernatural author, and lover of all things true crime. On this show, we're going to deep dive into topics that don't usually see the light of day. The spooky, the weird, the macabre, the paranormal, and of course, aliens. Sit back, grab a cup of tea, and let's get on with the show.
You want answers, not motivational quotes pretending to be guidance. You want the truth that changes things. That's where I come in. I read energy like a detective. Your patterns, your blocks, the turning points you feel coming but can't name yet. I translate what the universe has already lined up for you. I'm Heather, psychic, coach, witch. 25 years of helping people stop the self-sabotage and step into their power. If you're ready to move, text me 25224194447. Real guidance, real clarity. Zero games. That's me, 25224194447. Let's pull the cards and see what happens next. Now put your tinfoil hat on. Curiosity engaged. Let's get into the podcast.
Tonight we have a very special guest. Kathleen Marden is with us. She's the author of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. Hi, how are you doing tonight?
I'm fine, thank you.
Oh, good. Now, this is a very interesting book because unlike most books that are written about experiences like this, you are the niece of Betty Hill, correct?
Yes, I am.
You have a very different perspective than most people do because you are actually there.
I was actually there from day one.
What's interesting about that, too, is from that perspective, your book is actually very objective, but it's also very personable at the same time. So you take into account everybody's perspective and everybody's point of view, and you insert your own in a very objective way. Go ahead and tell everybody the premise of the book.
I set out initially to find out for myself if my aunt and uncle had actually been abducted by a UFO. I had always believed that they had actually had a close encounter, but I wanted to test the hypothesis that Barney had merely absorbed dreams that Betty had about abduction after the encounter, after Betty became convinced that the dreams were real. And having a background in social science and education, it was very important to me to be objective and unbiased in the work that I was doing. And what I found in the end, after I had transcribed all of the hypnosis tapes that my aunt and uncle had with outstanding, renowned psychiatrist Benjamin Simon, who was a skeptic, I did a comparative analysis of my aunt and uncle's statements, their dream material, and I found evidence that I believe indicates they truly were abducted. And all of that is in the book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. So the premise from which I started the book actually was to present whatever evidence I could find that they were or were not abducted by a UFO, and to talk about the problems with hypnosis, the problems with Betty's dreams, and to present in a very objective and unbiased way all of the physical evidence, the chemical analyses of the dress that Betty was wearing that night. And we can get into that a little bit later if you'd like to.
Sure.
In more detail. And I asked Stanton Friedman to join me in this endeavor after I had written quite a lot of the book. But it occurred to me that the book would be strengthened by having the input of a well-known physicist, a physical scientist, a scientific ufologist, and Stanton Friedman had such a wonderful reputation for his meticulous research. I knew that he would be objective and unbiased as well. And I had known him for about 20 years. He had met my aunt, and my uncle knew my aunt well. I had seen him at her house before, and he and I had actually worked together on committees. We're both involved with a mutual UFO network. For over 10 years, I was the National Director of Field Investigator Training. So I, in the year 2005, presented a proposal to Stan to join me in writing some of this book and also in vetting the work that I had done for accuracy, because it was most important to me that this book would be objective and unbiased.
Yes, and I think that's one of the strengths of the book is that you really get a very thorough, detailed account of what led up to the sighting of the abduction and what happened afterwards. It's a very good timeline, and even post the encounter, what happened afterward with their lives and what happened with Betty. And I just thought it was such a wonderful account of somebody's life. And just for people that don't really know too much about the Betty and Barney Hill story, can you just give a little synopsis of what happened?
Yes, I certainly can. My aunt and uncle had taken a brief vacation to Niagara Falls and to Montreal, Canada in 1961. It was September 1961. And they had planned to spend the night in Montreal, but decided to drive on down through Canada into New Hampshire, planning to stop to spend the night if they became too tired to drive. As they were driving along, my uncle realized that he had a wonderful day, a wonderful night's sleep the night before. He worked nights anyway, so he felt that he could drive home. And as they were driving through the mountain area of New Hampshire, my aunt spotted what appeared to be a very bright star, perhaps a satellite or perhaps a falling star, only it fell upward next to the moon. It was right on the left-hand side of the moon, just above the planet Jupiter. And as she watched it as they traveled along, it grew larger and larger. It was coming closer and closer, and this really sparked her curiosity. So, in an area of New Hampshire called Franconia Knot, which is quite a famous tourist attraction in the state of New Hampshire, just north of there, about 5 miles north of there, Betty finally convinced Barney to stop the car to get a look at this thing. And so they stopped first time and watched it through binoculars. Betty saw that it was traveling across the face of the moon, flashing long points of multicolored light. Barney then took the binoculars as it left the face of the moon and traveled in a northwest direction toward Vermont. Suddenly, it turned and rapidly descended in Barney's direction, and it reminded him of a huge aircraft coming in for a landing. And the funny thing about it was that it came back so very rapidly, and it was completely silent, and it didn't have conventional lighting. Now, Barney did not believe that UFOs were real, and he kept trying to convince himself that's not what he was seeing. He got into the car and he started to drive down through Franconia Notch as he and Betty watched this craft at a landmark called the Old Man of the Mountain. The craft shifted around from the back of Cannon Mountain and stopped just right beside the old man's face. Now, the old man is a natural granite structure 43 feet high, and the craft at that point was nearly twice the length of the old man's profile. And Betty and Barney stopped the car, took the binoculars again, and watched this silent, rotating craft. At that point, it appeared to be cigar-shaped. They got back into the car, and as they were driving through Franconia Knot, this was following the tops of the mountain, sometimes coming down in front of the mountain, and it seemed to be bouncing around in the sky. It would descend, vertically. It was traveling in a stair-step pattern, and at one point it seemed to bounce back and forth in the sky just like a ball on an elastic band that's attached to a paddle that would bounce out and bounce back. And as they were leaving Franconia Notch, this was an area of, probably about 7 or 8 miles long, they came to another tourist area, and this was called Indian Head. They saw motels and cabins there. There was also at that time a nature center, and they felt very comforted to be back into civilization instead of out in the wilderness. And they decided that they would stop and get another good look at this craft. But before they were able to even stop, the craft rapidly traveled ahead of them and stopped directly over the top of the road and just to the right of the road, causing Barney to have to stop the vehicle directly in the middle of the road. He grabbed the binoculars, had a pistol as well, jumped out of the car, and looked at this craft. And as he was looking at it, it shifted location to an adjacent field. Now, at this point, the craft was only about 100 feet above Betty's and Barney's car. And they could see that it had stopped rotating. There was a double row of windows that circled around the front side of this disc-shaped craft that had a rim around the bottom. And as Betty sat in the car looking to oncoming traffic with the dome light on, Barney walked toward this craft, which descended even lower in his direction. He held the binoculars up to his eyes, and he observed 9 to 11 figures behind those windows looking down at him. Suddenly, all but one moved away from the windows and went to a panel on the back wall of this hallway or this corridor that circled around the exterior portion of the craft. They seemed to be doing something. He could see their arms moving, and they, at that point, seemed to cause the craft to tip toward Barney. He also saw little fin-like structures coming out of the sides of the craft. They were red. And he saw something drop down from the bottom of the craft. The figure standing at the window scared Barney. He became terrified because it reminded him of a German military officer. He felt threatened. He was threatened by the precision of movement of these figures at this time, and there was something about their appearance that frightened him terribly. He wanted to go for his gun. He couldn't. He wanted to pull the binoculars away from his eyes, but he wasn't able to do that. But finally, he was able to pull them away, running and screaming back to Betty that he thought they were about to be captured. Now, this was all part of Betty's and Barney's conscious memory. They never forgot this portion of the trip. As Barney returned to the car, the craft shifted from the field and was right above the top of the car. He shifted into first gear and headed down the road as quickly as he could, shifting, and he told Betty to roll down the window and look up to see if she could see the craft. She rolled down the window, but she could only see blackness. She was expecting to see the light from the craft or to see the moon and the stars up above. It was a bright, starry night. All she could see is blackness. And suddenly, she and Barney heard a series of beeping or buzzing sounds that seemed to bounce off the trunk of the vehicle and caused a vibration to pass through their bodies. And this vibration also passed through the car. Betty wondered if they were going to receive an electrical shock, but she felt of the metal and she didn't receive a shock, but thankfully. And it seemed to have some kind of effect upon Betty and Barney, where they started to lose conscious memories. Barney faster than Betty. She remembered sights 8 miles down the road. But Barney had pretty much forgotten at about that point. They were no longer communicating with each other. Betty remembered taking a sudden left-hand turn off Route 3, which was the main highway, north to south, in 1961. It has since been replaced by Interstate 93, but Route 3 is still there. It's a back road now. And they continued south. And about 35 miles south of that field, they saw what they thought at that point was a bright sphere or a bright fiery object in the road, silhouetted against some trees, and they heard a second series of beeping or buzzing sounds that brought them back to full consciousness. And they started to talk again. And then they continued home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on the seacoast where they live. When they arrived, it was already beginning to become daylight. They expected to be arriving at about 2 a.m, and they noticed that there were some things that were very wrong with the picture of what should have been when they arrived home. First of all, they were very worried that they had been contaminated by this craft. They both took very long showers, shampooed, and they didn't bring their luggage into the house. Betty threw away all of the food that they had in a cooler, and they noticed as they were getting ready for bed, first of all, their watches had stopped working. They were permanently broken. Betty's dress was torn. There was a 2-inch zipper at the top of her, 2-inch tear at the top of her zipper on one side, and the stitching, a 1-inch tear on the other side. The lining of her dress was torn from hemline to waist, and the stitching on the hem was torn down on the right side. The dress had been perfectly fine when she put it on in the morning. The tops of Barney's shoes were scraped. His shoulder was sore, and things just were not right. They went to bed and they went to sleep. And they woke up on that afternoon, September 20th, 1961.
So right away, they just had this feeling of trepidation, like just everything wasn't right.
That's correct. They immediately feared that they had been contaminated. They immediately noticed that things were not right with their clothing, with their bodies, with the way they felt.
Because the whole throwing away the food, these towering, it's all very much like I've been invaded in some way and I need to get rid of everything, just purge it all. Their actions of just things not being right. I guess that to me was very telling, because people don't do those sorts of things unless it's an instinctual thing, but it's a survival thing. So
that's correct. Yes,
right.
I agree.
So what happened after that?
Barney had told Betty that no good could come out of telling anybody about this experience, and that they should both forget it. But Betty couldn't forget it, and she told Barney that she needed to tell at least one person, and that was my mother. So she phoned my mother, and I sat in the dining room as my mother talked on the phone to Betty about the experience. I overheard the phone call, and my mother told Betty that she would phone a neighbor of ours who was a physicist and ask him for advice. So my mother phoned him, and he told my mother that if Betty had a compass, that she should go out to the car to see how the compass would react. So my mother phoned Betty, and she actually did have a compass. She and Barney had a little squabble about that compass because he didn't want her to go out. He wanted her to completely forget about it. But she went out, and when she went out, she started the side of the car with the compass, and the needle might have fluctuated a little bit from the metal of the old car or up near the engine. But when she got to the trunk of the car, she noticed that there were a number of bright, shiny spots that hadn't been there the night before. They were circular in shape. It appeared that they had been highly polished, or a template had been placed down and lacquer had been applied. They were very shiny against the duller surface of the vehicle. And when she placed the compass over them, the needle would spin and spin. She had to show this to somebody, so she owned an apartment building, tenement house, and she had one couple renting at that time, and she showed it to the couple. Barney went out, and he also saw what happened. So she phoned my mother and reported back to my mother. And we made a decision that we would go to visit and see the spot as soon as possible. But at that point, my father's best friend, who was the chief of police in a neighboring town, said that he had received orders from Pease Air Force Base that if anyone had a UFO sighting, they should report it to the base. So my mother communicated that information to Betty as well.
So she reported it right away.
Yes, she and Barney argued about that too. He didn't want to make a report, but the chief of police had told Betty that's what she needed to do. But Barney said to leave him out of it. So the following morning, she phoned Pease Air Force Base, and she made a report. And the man that she spoke to was so interested in what she had to say that he wanted to speak to Barney. And Barney, since he was being taken seriously and there was serious interest from the Air Force, decided that he would talk to this man. And eventually he was patched through to another base someplace else. I don't know for sure, but Project Blue Book was located at Wright-Patterson. So there's a good chance that it was patched through to Wright-Patterson. And he was interviewed there. And he gave a very detailed description of what he saw, how large it was, and all of the things that I told you, except for the figures behind the window. Barney was afraid to think he was a crackpot. He felt uncomfortable about reporting a flying saucer in the first place, so he didn't report those figures. They phoned him back later on. The officer said that he had been working on it and had a few more questions, and he interviewed Betty and Barney some more, and then said he would call them if he had other questions. But he never did phone back.
Then Betty started having dreams, correct?
Yes, it was about 2 weeks later when Betty had a series of dreams. Barney was working nights, so he didn't hear about those dreams. But they were very disturbing. Some of them were more than just dreams. They were nightmares. And what was odd about them is that they contained memories of the trip that Betty consciously recalled, but they also included an abduction experience where they were taken on board the craft and given a physical examination. She didn't remember, the dreams didn't contain any information about Barney's examination, only about her own. But she wrote the dreams down on scraps of paper and placed them in her dresser, and she couldn't forget about them. And she ended up telling her supervisor at the welfare department about them. She was a social worker. And the supervisor thought that perhaps they gave some indication of maybe what had happened that night. So Betty became curious. She told NICAP investigator Walter Webb. NICAP stands for the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And on October 21st, 1961, Walter Webb interviewed Betty and Barney for a period of 6 hours separately about their conscious memories of the experience. He didn't include Betty's dreams in his initial report, a confidential report, by the way. And so I think that she probably didn't mention them at that time. It was later, in November of 1961, that she actually wrote them down into a storyline. And that dream sequence appears for the first time in The Interrupted Journey, written by John G. Fuller in 1966. I also talk about it in a chapter in Captured, because those dreams were so problematic in determining whether or not Betty and Barney had a real experience.
And but what's so interesting about it, though, is that he kept them from Barney, or kept them from everybody, really. It wasn't really something that she talked about. And so later on, when it comes up, if Barney actually knew about those dreams, it seemed that she did everything she could, really, just to work it out herself. Like it was her own cross to bear.
Yeah, she did initially. And Barney really didn't want to hear about them. He, however, did overhear Betty telling Walter Webb about the dreams one time. He was in a different room, but he did overhear part of what she said. And then in 1963, in November of 1963, he overheard those dreams again. So he did actually hear them, although she never directly told him about her dream.
So they never really had a conversation where she said, "Hey, I'm having these dreams, and this is what it." He didn't hear it, the full story, basically.
That's correct. She
It
never
was just hearsay.
communicated that information to him.
Okay. Which is really important later on because of when they went through the hypnotherapy.
Yes, that's correct. Would you like me to talk about that?
Yeah, because that's really where the bulk of the actual abduction came about.
It indicates to me that perhaps part of that dream sequence were only dreams had by Betty, experienced by Betty, and might have been fantasy material, just like dreams are. But I think that some of her dreams, or nightmares, had a foundation in reality. There was material that both Betty and Barney spoke about under hypnosis that wasn't in Betty's dreams. And it was in great detail, and it was very different and contradicted information in Betty's dreams. Yet Betty and Barney's accounts under separate hypnosis with amnesia imposed at the end of each session, so they didn't even know what they themselves had told Dr. Simon, said the same thing. For example, Betty and Barney were stopped, and when Barney drove off the main highway, they drove onto an old dirt logging road, and there were figures in the road. I have a feeling that very bright, fiery sphere that they saw was actually the craft either depositing those figures onto the road or departing. I'm not sure which, but from Barney's statements, it seems that's what had happened. But they encountered not the 8 to 11 figures in the road that Betty reported, but Barney counted only 6. Why only 6? If he absorbed Betty's dream. Betty counted 6, but then it's a little hazy. There might have been 2 more. I'm not sure if she was counting 3 that went to her door, and then a couple that were going to Barney's door, or not. But each said that 3 went to their car doors. That wasn't in Betty's dream. What was in Betty's dreams is that their car was surrounded by these alien figures. So this is very different from her dreams, but precise in detail about what Betty and Barney said. Betty's dreams had Betty and Barney sitting quietly and silently in the vehicle. Betty and Barney were both terrified. Barney wanted to go for his gun, but he was afraid he'd be harmed. Betty took a hold of the car door. She was going to try to escape into the woods, but she was prevented from doing so because these creatures came up to the car and removed them, opened the doors, and took them out. When they did, they pointed something at Betty, and she lost consciousness at that point. Barney also lost consciousness, and he was dragged along. He could feel the tops of his shoes bumping and bouncing on the rock as he was taken up this path through the woods. Betty regained consciousness, and they were taken to a clearing. She could see the darkened crest at that point. She thought she didn't want to go on the crest, but they took her under control. This was probably where her dress was torn. And Barney could feel his feet going up a ramp. The surface was different from the rock that his shoes had been bouncing on. And he could feel himself, his toes, scrape over the top of an elevated surface as he was taken on the craft with his eyes closed. They were taken into separate rooms. They were given physical examination. These beings were very different from the ones in Betty's dreams. The ones in Betty's dreams were very human in appearance. They had black hair, dark eyes, bluish lips. They were about 5.5 feet tall, and they were wearing blue cadet-type uniforms. The beings that Betty and Barney were taken on board the craft by were not human-looking at all. And there are actually paintings of them in the book based upon Betty's detailed and Barney's detailed descriptions. And they were hairless. They had large, dark eyes. They were very much like the grays that you see in pictures today. They had large, barrel-type chests. They had a split for a mouth, no external ear, very flat noses that had little flared upturned nostrils. They both mentioned that when they communicated in their own language, there was a mumbling or humming type sound that came from them. And they remembered seeing a membrane that covered their mouths, and the membrane fluttered. They were very interested in Betty's and Barney's mouth and Betty's and Barney's teeth. Barney wore dentures, and they actually took the dentures out and they tugged on Betty's teeth. That tugging was in Betty's dream sequence, but Barney did not mention that his dentures were removed during his hypnosis sequence. He only felt fingers going into his mouth. The beings on board this craft were very interested in Betty's and Barney's skeletal structure. They counted the vertebrae in their spine. This was different from Betty's dream sequence. In the dream sequence, they did what seemed like an EMG on Betty, or a nerve conduction test, where they placed a stylus along her spine. Barney could feel what felt like fingers pressing against his spine, and at a later date, when I was taking Betty back using a cognitive interviewing technique, she also recalled a pressing against her spine and didn't mention the machine that she recalled in her dream. I found this quite interesting. They were also interested in Betty's and Barney's reproductive system, and they actually placed a cup-like device over Barney's groin, probably to extract a semen sample. they placed a long needle in Betty's navel, thinking that it wouldn't hurt. It actually did hurt her. She was in so much distress that Dr. Simon had to end the hypnosis session early. She was crying and screaming and traumatized.
That's interesting, too. I actually saw your presentation at the Roswell Festival, and those tapes, just from the little that you actually played, they're so wrought with emotion. It's very hard to hear them because just from the tapes alone, something happened to them. There's this trauma that you can't fake.
That is true, and I actually censored those tapes. So what you heard was not as emotional as some of what is on the actual hypnosis tape.
Just the tapes alone made me think that something happened to them. I mean, you can't fake that sort of emotion. It's just very wrong.
That's very true. And Dr. Simon actually said that Betty and Barney exhibited more emotion during the reliving of that abduction than he had ever seen in any of the returning war veterans that he treated after World War II. He made his reputation as a psychiatrist at the Mason General Hospital. He set up the psychiatric unit there on Long Island, New York, to treat shell shock victims, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, returning from World War II. He had a very high rate of success. And that's why Betty and Barney were referred to him in the first place.
Now, during all this, I wasn't real clear in the book. It seemed like he believed them, but then he didn't. Like, he kept trying to tell them that they made it up.
Yes, he was having difficulty with that because Betty's and Barney's stories were so similar that it was almost as if two people were telling the same event. Now, he expected their stories to be similar or to match during the part that they consciously remembered. But when the stories met during the abduction sequence, he tried to find an explanation. And he started to look at Betty's dreams. He questioned Betty and Barney over and over again. Who told you this, Barney? Who told you what Betty has told me? This has all been in Betty's hypnosis. And why did you tell me the same thing? You must have heard this from somebody. And Barney just kept saying, no, I didn't hear it from anybody. And so Dr. Simon said to Barney, if you didn't hear it from all of these people, where did you get this story from? And Barney replied, I was hypnotized by Dr. Simon, and Dr. Simon told me to remember, and I remembered. So that must have been really confounding for Dr. Simon. And in the end, although he was a skeptic, he had to admit that he couldn't disprove anything that Betty and Barney told him under hypnosis. So he had to leave it open, although he, I believe, did prefer that dream hypothesis. I have refuted that dream hypothesis in the book in great detail, and it was difficult to do just listening to the tape. I had to actually transcribe those tapes. It took me hours and hours to transcribe 10 hours of hypnosis tape, and to dissect them sentence by sentence and line them up and compare Betty's statements to Barney's statements, and then to compare them to the statements in Betty's dreams. So it was really fascinating.
And also, it's very thorough in the book, too. Definitely, if you want a very thorough comparative analysis of Betty, Barney's, and the dream sequence, every question I had was pretty much answered.
I'm glad to hear that I answered all of your questions. So many people had questions after reading The Interrupted Journey. It wasn't a complete story. And of course, it was written in 1966. So we had the rest of Betty's and Barney's lives and experiences to go through, too. And I included all of those questions and all of the missing information in Captured.
Definitely. And there's an irony here to the story, too. I know that Barney was vehement against everybody knowing about this incident. And then the irony is that it became probably one of the most famous abduction stories ever.
If you don't mind, I'd like to tell you how that came about.
Sure. That's great.
Barney had a reputation to protect. He not only worked for the post office, but he was very active in the civil rights movement. He and Betty were both local members of the NAACP, where Barney served as the legal redress and Betty was the secretary. He was on the regional board of the NAACP. During his lifetime, he was appointed to represent the state of New Hampshire on the advisory committee for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, for the Office of Economic Opportunity. He was also the first executive director of the Rockingham County Community Action Program. He was very politically active at a local and state level. He campaigned along with Betty for Lyndon Johnson, and Betty and Barney and I all went to Johnson's inauguration as invited guests because of the work that the three of us did on his campaign. Betty and Barney were very involved in the literacy program in the state of New Hampshire. She was a social worker with a very good reputation, and they had a lot to lose by having their story become known. That's why it remained confidential for as long as it did. But in 1965, through a breach of confidentiality, a Boston newspaper reporter heard about their story. He contacted them. Took him a lot of time and trouble to find out who they were, but he did get that information. He wanted them to cooperate. They refused. They begged him not to publish anything about it. They went to a lawyer to try to prevent the story from being told. They thought that it wasn't going to be told, but they were surprised when, in late October 1965, for 5 nights in a row, their experience ran in the Boston Traveler newspaper. They were shocked. The story went worldwide. They were inundated with media, with newspaper reporters. They had to flee from their house. It was funny, on one night they actually stayed with an officer at Pease Air Force Base for protection from the media.
Oh my gosh.
And so their story became known at that point. And so they decided in November of 1965 to speak about it for the first time. They were introduced by the public information officer at Pease Air Force Base, and they spoke at a Unitarian church in Dover, New Hampshire. And this is where they actually met John Fuller. Oh. He was in New Hampshire doing research for a book that he was writing on UFOs, on UFO sightings that were occurring at that time. And that was called Incident at Exeter. And so he met with Betty and Barney. He introduced himself after they spoke. They didn't speak about the abduction. They only spoke about their sighting. And he proposed to them that they would work with him to tell the whole truth. So Betty and Barney talked about it, and they decided they'd like to have Dr. Simon involved in it as well. And they all cooperated in telling the full story, or as much of the story as they could tell, without breaching confidentiality. And The Interrupted Journey was finally published in 1966. And it was covered in Look magazine also that year. And actually, my high school graduation was covered by a photographer from Look magazine who came. He went to my graduation party afterwards, and took photographs to show what a normal family we actually are. Those photographs never actually made it into Look magazine because they decided to use a different type of paper than the glossy paper that they used in Look. But I still do have the photograph.
That's amazing. And then later on, it was a movie with James Earl Jones.
Sal Parsons in October of 1975. It was a made-for-TV movie. It wasn't entirely accurate. Movies never are, by the way, but it was a good movie, and it was well received. The only problem with it was that some skeptics have used the movie to refute the abduction when the movie wasn't accurate. So that was laziness on their part. They need to do their homework better.
Yeah, use the movie as evidence to refute an experience. That's ridiculous.
We have to be an armchair. Have to do is watch a movie and make up a few things and read some hearsay, and you can easily refute it. It's not based upon factual evidence, not based upon facts at all, but you can refute it if you want to make up a story.
I really want to get to the dress because you went to great lengths to have that dress analyzed because there was a pink powder on it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. When Betty finally did remove her dress from the closet to repair it, she noticed that it was covered with a pink powdery substance. So she took the dress and she hung it on her clothesline, and the powder blew away, but the dress was ruined. It was deeply stained with pink in certain areas. And so it was so badly stained, especially along the hem and around the sleeves and along the top of the bodice, that she initially threw it into the trash, but immediately retrieved it on second thought and hung it in her closet, thinking that it might hold some evidence to prove what actually did happen to her that night. The dress underwent chemical analysis for the first time in 1978 at the University of Cincinnati through the chemistry department. And they tested it for a number of different things to try to create the same problem that the dress had, that pink staining. They could not duplicate it with any of the tests that they tried. It went through several other tests, but the most thorough analysis was done by analytical chemist Phyllis Budinger. She has a master's degree in chemistry. She was a research scientist for BP Amoco Oil Company, which was formerly Standard Oil for 35 years. And she met with Betty and myself in the year 2001 in Rochester, New York. And she photographed the dress. She thoroughly examined it. She cut swatches from the dress, and she took it back to her laboratory in Ohio. And from 2001 until October of 2003, she conducted a very thorough chemical analysis on the dress. She speculated that the captor's respiratory emissions might have deposited on Betty's dress because Betty had mentioned a very foul odor on board that craft. And so she speculated it might have been that. There was also speculation that this might have been the result of these aliens touching Betty's dress in certain areas. And this happened only on Betty's dress and not Barney's suit, we think, because his suit was immediately sent to the dry cleaners and laundered. Betty's dress wasn't. At the end, Phyllis concluded that the stained areas were coated with a biological material, which is mostly protein with a small amount of natural oil, and that the protein attacked the fiber and the dye in the stained area and broke down the fiber structure. The natural oil did not come from Betty's body. None of this came from Betty's body, and this made it highly unusual. There was also a bacterium found on the dress that's common to our natural environment, but it couldn't have gotten there by hanging in Betty's closet for 40 years. Phyllis has a dress that she has had hanging in her closet for 40 years. She's thoroughly examined it. It's very similar to Betty's dress. And she's tested her dress. And the same bacterium is not on her dress. So none of this could have happened by simply being in Betty's closet. In the end, Phyllis made the statement that her chemical analysis supported Betty's statement that she was abducted, which I think is quite a very strong statement coming from a research scientist. Phyllis is not biased in any way. I found this to be very significant.
So the natural oils, that's really interesting. So they weren't from Betty, did they find out that they were human, or did they know what it was? It just was a natural oil. They weren't sure where it came from, or?
Phyllis speculated that perhaps they were deposited on Betty's dress by the captors. So what she did was she had DNA testing done on Betty's dress, and she cut out just very few samples. And there was a problem with the DNA testing. They couldn't get a complete DNA sequence. There was an inhibitory substance on the dress. And I'd like to know what that substance was. I really do. And to actually talk to a geneticist about this. But there was an inhibitory substance there. So what they had to do was to use some type of chemical, and they use this kind of chemical when they're doing genetic testing, say on dinosaurs or on ancient artifacts.
Right.
And they use that to extract a limited chain of DNA from Betty's dress and from different areas of the dress. So it was really difficult to tell what it actually was. They found a proteobacterium splotch on the left sleeve of the dress. They found some human ribosomal DNA, which could have been also a mouse gene or a cow gene. They found human mitochondrial DNA, and they found a genetic structure from a population from East Asia on the dress. And they also found spider blood on the lining of the dress that somehow had gotten there. It still leaves a big question. They didn't find any DNA that they couldn't identify as coming from something on Earth.
If you want, just give your website information and where they can get the book.
Yes, my website is Kathleen Marden, all one word, Kathleen.GooglePages.com.
Very cool. I want to thank you very much for being on the radio show, and you're always invited back. And this has been very fascinating. And everybody go out there and buy the book, because it's a great story.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the NVus Alien Podcast. For show notes, go to the website www.nvusalien.com. All of the reference materials and mentions in this episode are linked there. If you want more witchy, paranormal, and fringe content, please subscribe to my Substack. Just search Heather Ashera, that's Heather Ashera, or check the link in the show notes. And as always, see you on the flip side.